15 people.
Okay. And that was just drawing office or?
Yeah. So here's an interesting perspective. This method of working and the number of fonts it produced totals probably 600 plus fonts.
Okay.
And that's what was created from, the inception of the company up until roughly 1970. Okay. Right? But when I say 600 fonts, that's not accounting for the different point size masters. So it was actually a much bigger undertaking
so
than
600
that.
different designs.
600 designs times the number of master sizes. But from the years when I started there, late 60s, or let's say 1970, until when I left there, which was 84, the size of the library doubled from 600 to about 1,200 fonts.
Okay.
And this, generally speaking, this method of working was abandoned.
Okay.
Because this was really based on the hot metal world.
Yeah.
And the font doubling really included the new fonts for the photo typesetting world.
Right. So now at this point, the explosion of phototype, ITC is making fonts, and everyone has a program for making fonts, and typositors are all over the place with film strips. So the focus for Linotype became sort of outside of the newspaper business and to capture more of the font market.
Okay.
And then we started working with things like cameras. Okay, I would say that the rules and the quality and so on of the fonts were adhered to, but the working method changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So these patterns were not produced after the 1970s.
Right. This is a terrific example right here. This font, this character was drawn by my mentor in '49, Prema, to make hot metal. For a hot metal face. Interesting too, if you didn't notice that they're all backwards. The drawings are all backwards. And these red marks on here signify the unitization for changing this character from metal to film.
So you kept the same drawing?
Yeah. So see this? Here's your original drawing. Okay. And then here's a crosshair on it.
Yes.
Okay. And here are some figures here. Here's the original side bearing. These are all in mils or thousandths of an inch.
Okay.
4.5 and 4. When it changed to film, it became 4 3/4 and 4 1/4.
Okay.
Okay. Very slight variation in the fitting. You see these little marks there? That's where the line of film O fits. This is OWO in hot metal.
Okay.
This is OWO in Linotype. That little bit difference.
What was the difference between the unit system between the Linotype, the hot metal world, and the photo typesetting world?
Well, hot metal could be anything you wanted it to be, right? Because it's a physical piece of brass, and it's...
But it had to run on the channel of a magazine.
Right. So... there were, to my recollection, I didn't do a lot of hot metal work, but I did do some hot metal work. And there were a lot of standard sizes. It seemed like characters ended up on a lot of the same sizes, frequently like half an M and quarter of an M and things like that.
Siebold once told me that the Linotype was a 15-unit system, but they never used that term.
No.
They used the fractions of an inch.
Right.
But it was a limited system because even though you say you could make it as wide as you wanted, you still had the limitations of the mat running in a magazine.
Right.
But when you got to photo typesetting, you now had an 18-unit system.
Right.
So you were more open to designing the character more for what you wanted.
Yeah, that's right. So these holes here were punched in here for a Kodak registration bar. Okay, that bar, the nibs on that bar stuck through those holes.
So originally you didn't have the holes when
right.
The original drawing.
Then you had a mask where you laid the grid down on this crosshair.
Okay.
Okay, that you could see through to the character. And then you had a Frisco.
Okay.
And you would cut these shapes these are predominantly, and most of the libraries predominantly done with straight edges and curves, French curves.
So why do you have all these little?
Oh, I didn't get to that part of the story yet. And so that was the film. That was the line of film character as well.
Okay.
And all of these red marks on here refer to that. Okay, this was
Oh,
on
and then
16
here it
of
tells-
18 units,
Okay.
right? These are the side bearings. This is the fitting. And that was your line of film character. Now comes late 70s and their first digital system, which is the Icarus system from Peter Carroll. So these marks are the digitization points
So you just added layers of technology to the.
for entry into the Icarus system.
So this is a great example of it. It was a hot metal drawing, it was a film drawing, and then it became a digital drawing.
That's right.
Wow.
That's correct.
The whole history of type is in this one
In
drawing.
one single drawing. So that means that you didn't need to draw separate characters when adapting from metal to the liner film.
Well, let's go back and I'll show you where they did. Okay, so where you roll around.
Oh, sorry.
I hope I will show you.
I'm just going to take it.
So when you said frisket, do you mean they cut something out of ruby lith?
Yeah, that's right. All of these characters at their actual size were cut in ruby lith,
And then photographed on a camera?
but not all the master sizes. So what became, again, for background, I'm not sure how many master point sizes of primer exist, but the first film, the liner film machine, supported three master size ranges, and traditionally they would use the 8, 12, and 18 point drawings to represent those.
Okay, that explains a lot.
Thanks.
By the way, just as sort of an aside, when you worked like this, if you wanted to not be in trouble with the boss, you were expected to get about 15 of these done a week.
Oh,
15 of the sheets or the whole book?
15 drawings a week.
That was it?
Yeah.
Wow. So 3 a day.
If you fell to 12, you were in trouble. If you were a top producer, you could get in the high teens. But everything you did was checked. Notice O is the title block that's filled out. See someone's name on it. O is an approval signature. Okay,
So who would approve? Would it be the...
Well, every drawing office had a supervisor.
And would you have one person working on one of these fonts, or would you have many different people working on the same?
Well, you'll see a couple of different names here, but it wouldn't be uncommon that you would find them doing groups of characters.
Okay.
This guy's Hans Meyer. I don't know that it's the Hans Meyer that we're familiar with.
Yeah, I was wondering.
But see, he didn't do all the lowercase because John Caranta did some of them.
Okay. And that was 1948 and some of them
50.
50.
So,
Some of them were dated 49, so this project went on for a while.
oh yeah. Well, this was a big investment if you decided to make a font in hot metal. So I'll show you some of the other things that went into the care of that. This is the original hot metal J. Okay, with a side bearing on it, so the lead doesn't leak out of the mat when you set your type. And this was, interestingly, this number, 1.5 thousandths of an inch, kind of plays repeatedly over and over in tolerances and what they could achieve.
Okay.
It was kind of the minimum side bearing that they wanted to see. Even in the film, you had asked about script fonts and compensations for film. This sort of measurement, 1.5 thousandths, that was about what they could achieve in a film font too. as an actual measurement, you know, given the science of emulsions and all of those things. That was about as fine as you could get
As
it.
you could get. Okay, interesting. Just trying to get a good photo.
Okay.
So if it says here linofilm, does that
Yeah.
mean
That means at some point that character was unitized,
even though
just the way you see it there,
you...
yeah?
Okay.
Without any modification. Now we have another version of this character where the difference is S1 means special one.
Okay.
Long descend is made to go on 13-point slug. So if you want a little nicer font, a little longer descender, you had to spend some extra money on metal to do that. But that's how they would do it. It's a special one. Okay?
And by the way, that got recorded in this big book in the order department, so we knew that existed and could indicate it on the order form.
Now, oh, look at that.
Here you are.
Hey!
In 75. So this is a T drawing, and boy, that's a big story in itself. When they came with, by the time they got to the 202, 505, and 1010 machine line, these were CRT typesetters. And they got kind of jazzy with how they started doing some things. So mostly as cost-saving measures. You could, for example, take a Roman font and take those uppercase characters and lean them over. 12 degrees sounds like a good number, so they did that. And looks okay. But you can't do that with the lowercase, right? Because the shapes are different.
Yes.
So what you have is you have to make a whole range of lowercase characters, which in these folios are called T21, it's the designation, which were the lowercase characters tipped to 12 degrees, regardless of what the original italic might have been.
Okay.
All right, so the old font might have been 15 degrees, but the new CRT font was going to be 12 degrees. Right. Okay, so now why I have a T drawing in a Roman is a really good question. Another thing that happened with all of this jazz with the CRT machines is, so now that you tip if you study Roman to italic throughout the library, you'll find that the italics are lighter and the Romans are heavier. So if you make slightly, so if you make an italic by sloping the Roman caps, now the italic lowercase has to be heavier in order to accommodate the heavier Roman caps that you tipped over. Right? I'm not sure. It might have been a weight-related thing.
Can we compare?
Yeah, let's see how it's different. It's a little bit narrower.
They're both on 6 units.
16 and a quarter and a half. So the side bearing is a little bit different. This they're both on the same unit, but this one is 38 and a half. This one's 37. The ball's a little heavier. The stem is the same.
Is this heavier than this?
Looks to be a quarter of a thousandth heavier. But this is the same.
So did you sometimes have to redraw some of the characters so that I know that's one of the things that Monotype used to do is some of the serifs for the monophoto had to be redrawn to be heavier, or some of these.
No, I don't recall that.
You didn't have to do that.
No, I don't recall that.
By the way, the reason that they made the serifs light, especially in Times Roman, was more because of stereotyping at the newspaper.
Okay.
Lou Rosenblum can tell you that story about the serifs falling apart when they tried to make photo typesetting fonts from the drawings that they used for hot metal.
There's another little interesting thing about this drawing, just so I don't pass it by, but you see this number here?
Yes.
So this character is actually tilted a half of a thousandth off of straight.
Yes, I can see that. Why was that?
There was a range of characters that I was taught you should always tilt. And the reason is because the way they are physically, their weight hangs on one particular side, you know? And they were this one, this one, this one, this one for a different kind of a reason. This one, this one, this one, this one, this one. So in most of this library, all of these characters have those, which isn't something you wanted to do for digital, because it makes bumps where you didn't want bumps. But as an analog image, if you tip this, just to make this a little bit bigger, if you tip this back this way, okay, off of straight, you know, this way, it has a tendency to keep the character from looking like it's falling over this way.
Okay. So the A,
And
for
the same
example,
with
had to
this.
slice
The strategy on this one was, if you make this straight, then this has a tendency to look like it's sprung.
Okay.
Whereas if you tip it this way, in this direction, has a way of looking like it's straight. But that was already practice. And these were, I don't know, tried and true methods, I guess. I guess I know what they were talking about by the time I got there.
When you joined the drawing office, what was your profile? What, did you come straight from school? Or?
I came from a mechanical technology school, which was a state university of New York in Farmingdale. And the program was really on Long Island in the 60s. The big employers were the defense industry.
Okay.
And that was Grumman and Republic. Made jet planes and whatever. And that program that I was in, mechanical technology, was very much geared towards getting a job at one of those places. And around my second year, I dropped out, and I saw this job advertised in the paper.
Okay.
What did it say?
I think it said, it was listed under draftsperson, but then it said letter drawer. And I don't remember too much else about the body of it. But when I got there and someone put me on a light table, you know, with a slide rule and a T-square and some straight edges, that was not something I was unfamiliar with. So I wasn't intimidated by it.
So you had some ideas of technical drawing.
Yeah, but I had no idea about lettering at all.
Okay.
And
so did you have to go through some sort of training?
They give you the famous S test.
What's the famous S?
The famous S test is they hand you usually an uppercase S, and then they hand you the box that is the box that surrounds the small cap S, but it's blank. And they tell you, draw this S in that box.
That's very interesting.
And let's see what you can do.
And so that was like the interview. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And later on, I was showed a couple little tricks for doing that. Like you can do paper proportion if you know how to do that. You find some interesting points on the S, you know, and then you can. I don't know if this is a good example. This is a pretty good example. So, for example, I could find in the vertical where this point is and where this point is and where this point is and this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, try to estimate where the middle of this is.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could take that, let's say this with a bigger piece of paper, and I could turn that to kind of squeeze it into the smaller box
Okay.
and then draw lines off of that, right? And say, well, I know that I need to come in somewhere around here in order for this to look proportional.
Right.
Then you could do the same on the width, right?
Mm-hmm.
The width this is the width of the character,
Yes.
but you have this point horizontal and you have this point horizontal. So you can do the same thing there. Twist the paper and draw the line. Okay, this is a terrific example. So, Linotron, we know that we know a little bit about that. The original hot metal, the long descender, the Linotron thing that I can't remember why I made it. And
Is Linotron or Linofilm?
this is CRT. Anything
CRT.
with a T is Tron,
Okay.
CRT. But this, S101, to be used for linofilm.
So you actually had a separate drawing for the Linofilm. Oh, with the kernel. of
That's
course.
And this is the overhang. X6 3/4. So I think, remember I sent you a picture?
You did.
Ellie? I think this was the picture.
With all
I
the
might have had
different-
these put out like that. I don't know that you can get that in camera. I could send you that picture.
Oh, yes.
I did already,
You did.
but I have
yes.
some others too.
Oh, brilliant. And I'll take pictures little bit by little bit. So that's for the Linofilm. Is that
Yeah.
1956?
Yeah, that's right.
So
And
this
that's about as early as that machine is. So
that's
I
so
don't think
Primer
it was
would have
in the
been-
market much before that.
What's this?
My
Yeah.
Linofilm machine was launched when?
54, but was not successful, as you know.
54.
That was when they had shown it before that, but they formally introduced it in 54. They showed it officially in 58,
Yeah.
but had lots of problems.
Yeah. So this work might have even been done in anticipation of machine sales rather than as a,
Well, they had to do a whole batch of fonts as the machine was evolving.
yeah, sure.
So Primer would have been one of the first typefaces to be adapted to.
Yeah, because it was a textbook font, and that would have been a very big market for them.
Do you? I'm just trying to think how I can get high enough to take this.
You can stand on a chair,
Is
or
that
you can put it on the floor.
On top of that pattern. And then they had some kind of a crazy gizmo that used to bounce
Ball bearings.
ball bearings off of the pattern.
It was a pressure-sensitive film, and they were going to bypass all the drawings and use the pattern plates. I was there when they did that, and it was a disaster.
Well, John Caranta's complaint was, for all the work that went into those patterns, they're destroying them with this ball bearing machine.
Because the edges were not that clean and sharp, so they wound up having to draw stuff for it anyway. But the Linofilm Quick was just its own set of problems. By the way, the first time I ever got to a trade show was because the film transport didn't work at a trade show in D.C., so they came into the ed department. We need someone to fly to Washington immediately.
Uh-huh.
So I go down there with the film transport. And Art Coop, my boss, said, well, now that you're here, just buy whatever you need, stay overnight.
Yeah.
But it had nothing but problems with it. So when you got there, the letter drawing department was a large number of people because it was the 50s. It was they were coming back after World War II. Hot metal was still around, but they knew that photo typesetting was coming in.
When I got there, I think the VIP had already been launched.
That was 70.
Oh, so maybe not yet, but maybe there was work in anticipation.
That's right, because they called it, by the way, they called it the Linofilm VIP.
So I think that was the hiring.
To be,
Yeah.
because they were going to expand the font library when the VIP came out because the
Secure.
fonts were going to be cheaper to make.
Right.
They didn't know it was also cheaper for Storch to make.
Yeah, that's right. Leonard Storch. Used to drive around Manhattan in his Ferrari.
He once took me out on his yacht.
Nice. Do you want the rest of the story here?
Yes, I may as
This
well.
is S1. That was the long descender version.
And so when you joined the drawing office, were most people like you had training in drawing engineering, or?
In the 60s, and unlike the program in Reading and so on, where could you go to learn this stuff? There wasn't any place to go to learn it. So it was kind of OJT, it was on-the-job training. Mm-hmm. And if you went into a particular shop, Linotype, Monotype, whatever, you were going to learn their way of doing things. University of Mergenthaler, I guess, is all you could say.
And no one ever moved from Intertype to Mergenthaler or from Monotype?
Yeah, there wasn't much of that.
So did you have to go through a training program during the first weeks while you were there?
I would say to you, the training program was rather informal, and you were assigned a more senior person who sort of watched what you did and gave you tips along the way. Mm-hmm. And you were given easier projects at first.
Okay.
Go draw me an M-dash, kid. Let's see what you got. And if you couldn't do that, then
it could be simpler.
Right.
So did you ever cut Ruby?
Oh, yeah. I used to do that for overtime. And if you were average speed, you could probably do 5 or 6 an hour. And if you were real quick, you could do maybe 10. And since it was piecework, if you were quick, you could make some money out of it. So you'd take it home and do it and bring it back. But they'd look it over pretty good, and they would not take any shoddy work. Mm-hmm. I used to cut them the same way I drew them. So I drew this with French curves, and I would cut it with French curves.
Okay.
Some guys, Tom Henshaw's name sticks in my mind, developed a technique where they really did them pretty good. But what they did was they had a big open table like this, and they would hold the knife. Mm-hmm. Straight edge, they probably still do with a straight edge. But they would hold the knife and move the work. You know what I mean?
So they wouldn't move their hands.
Yeah, you hold the knife in one place and rotate the work around like this. Okay. And really a nice result.
But you didn't do it like.
No, I was kind of envious of his speed. It was fast, though, going that way. But no, I did the old-fashioned way. Mm-hmm.
So when they went to the digital world, did they use the rubies?
Yeah, they scanned them at very high resolution in a Selco scanner, millions and millions and billions of pixels.
And then when they went to the PostScript era, did they then use that data for the PostScript font?
I think they had, remember I told you I started in grid manufacture, mm-hmm. and then later on moved to type development in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. They were doing some crazy things back then, but they had a lot of high resolution data as a result of scanning the Friscuits. And they also had some clever engineers. Ricky Schreiber is a name that comes to mind. So prior to PostScript, they had some outline technology of their own. I think they called laser fonts or some such thing. So they were able to fit curves on high-resolution bitmap images. But all of that eventually lost out to the PostScript. Okay. And all their typesetters became PostScript typesetters.
And when did they get the first Icarus?
That was installed in Manhattan in, I'm going to say about 78. That was the first.
And that became the standard system for almost everybody.
The first encounter I had with digital fonts. And then, because they were kind of an older company and used to doing things a certain way, they did a silly thing with the Icarus, which was all of the digital data and the engineering and so on was under the ownership of Grid Manufacturing and those engineers, and that was in Plainview. New York, with the Icarus system, had all of this digital capability. So we used to digitize the drawings and capture them as curves, only to take that digital data and cut Frisquets out of it and feed it into their engine, which would scan it. So it was like, that was all pretty ridiculous. Okay, so there's some good example of how these drawings kind of live through the different technologies. Okay. So the other parts, and it would be common to see that for an F as well.
So that was really the main reason for creating new patterns. Was for creating the overhead. You didn't really make any other separate patterns unless you had.
Yeah, I think because they had the lion's share of the newspaper business. They had very successful fonts out there. They, I think, considered them to be state of the art, and they were interested in making improvements if they thought they could. But no one saw anything wrong with or a reason to overhaul what had gone before. But we'll look at an italic one, and that's a little different.
And what did Matt Carter do? Because I always saw him with some of these drawings.
Yeah, well, Matt from England worked for, as far as I know, his initial job in the font business was for Cross.
Yes,
Crossfield.
So he had some exposure to fonts, and of course his dad, Harry Carter. How he encountered Mike, I'm not sure, but they got to know one another quite well in the early to mid 60s. And Matt, got some very interesting projects to do, mostly under the direction of Mike. Mike wanted certain things done, and
Mike told me that Matt had one requirement to come work for him, and that is that Mike would not draw anymore, because Mike was always drawing stuff.
Yeah.
And so after Matt came, he wasn't drawing at all.
Yeah, I've never seen a drawing from Mike's hand. But, original F. I was just going to make the point that this is typical that for the same reason on the other side of the character. And another Tron drawing.
That's one of yours. Okay.
And
So does that mean that the Linotype couldn't kern, and that's why you had to revert to this kind of drawing?
No, the Linotype could kern.
Wait, now I don't think the original 1010 did. I think did it? Because I know the 202 did.
Looks like there was some issue about this character and its fitting. Maybe that was the reason behind it. See this comparison here of hot metal to film to what the O and N is to this fitting.
Okay. Do you mind if I take some
plus a unit. For some reason, maybe this original drawing was put on 6. And somebody thought that was a lousy idea.
That was 6.
This was on 7.
Interesting, because this one is on 6 units.
How come some of them have the holes punched and some don't?
Because you didn't really need to do that.
Okay.
I mean, what if instead of putting holes in it and putting the Kodak registration bar under the drawing, what if I just put the Kodak registration bar on the drawing?
Okay.
Right? What I had was a mask. The mask had a crosshair. You'd line that up with this, line the baseline up with this. So now you correct this way. Okay. Put the Kodak registration bar in, which so the mask and the frisket are cut with the same holes on the top. Pop it on there and then cut it.
And you mentioned that wherever there's green writing, that had to do with the quick.
Line it from quick, yep. 34th Street. I think it was 215, something like that. 34th Street, between 7th and 8th. In the Pennsylvania building.
And these books were in Plainview, but they were never moved to.
Right. So if you had to research something, you had to get in your car or get on a train and go do your research.
Interesting. Yeah. Of course, he had the greatest office in Brooklyn because it had all those wonderful built-in bookcases.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they ripped them out and put them against the cinder block walls in Plainview.
Yeah.
So it was terrible.
Yeah, that's right. The barrister.
Yes, they were gorgeous. Yeah, because Mike had the collection of all the company archives and all their books and specimen stuff.
I think that those bookcases might have survived the trip to Germany because I thought I saw Bruno Steiner selling them at one point.
By the way, I mentioned to Alice the Mergenthaler notebooks, which were in Parker's office. No one seems to know where they are anymore.
I've been to Germany to see the archives, but nobody has mentioned these notebooks. So I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of good. What Mike inherited as an archive was Jackson Burke's archive, which was also Chauncey Griffith's archive. So, I mean, there was a lot of, as far as business correspondence and planning, there was a lot of stuff.
A lot of that stuff has just disappeared.
Right.
It's very sad.
Right.
Very sad.
Okay, so you kind of get the idea of this, right?
Yes.
There's another long descender version. Okay. This one went in pretty much the way it was in hot metal. Okay. Oh, here's an interesting redraw here. There's a couple of thousandths in width added to this.
So why would that be? Would it be a customer complaining about the fitting, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
The original was 1948, and then this redraw
56. Somebody might have had an idea that would be an improvement. You know, a little bit wider character with a little bit, because this was unitized to 11, and this is also an 11, but the body of this character is wider.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also closer to the N, which would be typical.
And so when you redraw a character, would that just be done internally, or would you ask the original designer whether they agreed on that?
No, let's go back to those original 600 fonts, those first decades of work.
Yes.
So the contributing designers, the prominent ones were Dwiggins, for example. But all of those correspondence between Chauncey Griffith and Dwiggins, for example, and all of the artwork that came from Dwiggins' hand was not done like this. Okay. So it was all conceptual, and whatever happened to pass hands, but all of the drawing was done in the letter drum department. Okay. So the only way to get your fonts into the machine was through the letter drum office.
Okay. But would I imagine that once you had made these patterns out of the original artwork, then you would produce some proofs?
Yeah, so we might get lucky and even find those. Let's see what happens. So that's the drawing. Then the other components, we'll skip over some stuff, but all of these.
No, these are more. Which year are these ones?
This is my buddy, my mentor, JQ, who's working on a new font here called Prima Bold. And he stuck those characters in here, which is interesting. Well, that might be some of his last work. I think he's gone now. I'm sure he's gone. He would be 91 or so.
These ones have no date on them. So.
Yeah.
83.
Yeah. Jim Lyles, he works for Bitstream. This is what I was trying to get to. So this is a whole twist here. John Caranta, in his last few years at Linotype, did a bunch of the new series. Okay. New Caledonia, New Baskerville.
So what was meant by new?
Yeah, so those two fonts, for example, had added to them a black weight and a semi-bold weight. Okay. And new italic versions, same black and semi-bold. And, drawn to take advantage of 54 units or high resolution digital setters and all of that stuff. So this suggests to me that this was being planned as a new version of Prima. And to my knowledge, that never launched.
Interestingly, they seem to be still on the 18 unit system. This is 15, this is 9 unit.
Yeah. Well, I would say to you, if they didn't see a reason to change something, they wouldn't.
They would,
Now, of course, on the VIP, they did go to a 54 unit system later on.
Yeah, they did. And for most of the fonts that starting in the 50s were converted from metal to film in the 18-unit system, when Mike came out with the Advanced Typographers program, is eventually what that became. It became the 54-unit system, enhanced kerning. He had a marketing subscription thing where you could sign up for new fonts and stuff like that. But most of those fonts that existed as film already, their 54-unit values are multiples of their 18-unit
So
values.
they were not modified.
Right. They might have got some advanced kerning treatment and for the rest of the program. But the second sort of coming of the library, the last 12 years or so, when the library doubled and we were working with cameras and so on, all of those fonts were optimized for 54 units because there was no predecessor.
So you were able to work straight on with the 54.
Yeah, and I used to have, I don't have it here, but actually it was at Bitstream. I used to, when I worked at Bitstream, I used to try to leverage this. But you could take a font, something like a Universe or a Geometric that had a lot of different weights and run out an alphabet length. And if you plan that work properly, as the fonts increase in weight, the line lengths get longer because you gain some weight on the outside and the inside. The spaces diminish on the inside and the outside. The line lengths just grow. So at the end, you should have a nice sort of angled line.
Okay, so that's something you would work out.
Right. But if you took any of the Linotype 18-unit system fonts and went through that exercise, you wouldn't get that. You would get, what you'd see is the units for the Roman and the bold by and large are the same units. So their line lengths would be the same. And then if there was a black version, maybe that would be, so you'd get a step out like that. Right? Also, in each one of these folios, I'm doing something crazy here, is this thing. This is called the master sheet. So this was kind of part of the big plan.
Okay. So that was for hot metal originally.
Yeah, this relates to the hot metal font, but this shows you all of the overshoots and ascended heights and descended depths of various categories of characters. Okay.
And so for each new font, you would make that first.
In hot metal days, that was done. Yeah. This case from Uchiga, get these sketches in, but they needed to fit that to their method. And those drawings from different people might be of varying sizes. So projectoscope is a simple up and down camera. Something that would help you fit what the designer gave you to your system. Okay?
So from these patterns, you would make proofs.
Yeah, I was hoping to find that. So in a lot of the folios, at the very back, you'll find an envelope that will have some of the earliest proofs in it. But not always.
I found a few proofs in the correspondence files at the Smithsonian.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if we get a little lucky here. What is this one? This was file number 2 of the room. Some of these it's kind of unusual, but some of these fonts actually overspill the boxes, which is why you have file 2. Okay. That's not that common.
I just saw, are these lower cap versions of the cap which are lower for the
low
accents?
caps? Yeah, compare that.
Take a picture.
That was the idea of getting the accent over without spending any more money on the metal.
Okay.
So they call low cap accents and high cap accents. And sometimes Linotype did it, or sometimes the customer bought them and sent them to an independent company to put the accents on.
Right.
Like there was a whole business that grew up with people who did matrix contrast, engraving.
Excuse me. Here's the difference. 120 and a quarter thousandths. 104 and 3/4 thousandths.
And did you carry on doing that for film?
No.
That's right. I don't think in film we ever had low caps.
And they didn't want to spend the money on the metal, and they didn't want to use up the space.
And also, when we entered the photo typesetting era, we had what were known as floating accents. Mm-hmm. So the accent had a zero escapement.
Right.
So you would basically have the same letter.
And then just type the cap, and it would type the accent. It would put it over the accent, over the letter.
Excuse me, I get a drink of water.
There's bottled water up in the refrigerator if you want, and soda too.
Would you like something?
So that's a drawing by Ruzicka, and they decided not to use that character.
It sounds like he was happy with it, but the drawing office wasn't. My interpretation of that statement.
Do you think it would be because it was so wide?
Yeah, and the fitting. Mm-hmm. Too much space.
They still kept it.
I wonder how many fights there were between designers and the drawing office.
Well, that's another
because the drawing offices now has to adapt it to the actual needs of the machine.
Right. Yes.
And the designer is saying, "Oh, but you're destroying my creativity."
But that was one of my questions: is how, would you send proofs to the designers to review and make comments on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there was a ton of correspondence, back and forth about that.
So these are drawings for Fairfield.
Yeah, but right, that's Fairfield italic. Let's see what Tremor italic would like. Oh, okay, so here's a whole set of those T21 drawings that we had talked about earlier.
So these were for the Linotype.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the case where...
So even though the original of the 505 came out of England, all the fonts were done here?
We didn't have too much connection in the offices to what went on at Temple and what went on in the UK office and so on. I know Fiona worked there. Mostly, my knowledge of what they did was it was mostly foreign language fonts and Indian scripts and things like that.
I think so too.
So everybody kind of had their little piece of the battle, that they'll wage war on.
Parker said at one point he got everybody together and created this committee, and they would meet several times a year.
He used to have a type selection committee. Yeah. Of kind of upper to some middle managers. This one. Might have been a revision to the S101. So you had a hot metal version of the character.
Okay.
Yeah, this was the hot metal version. This was unitized to 9 units. Script for line flow in 61. See, that's what and then replaced by this.
So what? So this one is on 8 units.
Yeah, tighter fit. and then the Tron version. See, with the Tron version, there was these 12-degree lines
Okay.
to match the uppercase slope.
And so who would tell you that you need to redraw something? Would it be Mike Parker send an order to the drawing office, or how would that work?
Yeah, you had sort of different motivations. You might have a font under review for some reason because people are not happy with it or whatever, and it needs some revision. Right, possibly. You might have a brand new font in development, which is just kind of go at it. You might have a character that's missing the font that a customer needs. I drew a lot of German assets in my time. A lot of them had a lot of fonts that didn't have German assets.
Okay.
So, various reasons.
Because when contributing designer would provide artwork, did Mergenthaler ask him to provide all characters, or did he provide the basic set of characters and then the drawing of it added to it? How did that work?
Yeah, so I'm not so sure about that.
Okay.
And it might be dependent on the designer themselves, how involved they got to the nitty-gritty. I mean, as you can see by the index cards, if you're going to do them all, there's quite a bit to do.
Yeah.
But if you look on those sheets, sometimes it will tell you that the character is being substituted from another font. That was very common.
There were a couple of little tricks that went on, no doubt. When I said there was a pattern for every character, well, almost. Because actually that is true. There was a pattern for every character, but you could also scale with a pantograph machine, which was an old ATF trick, in order to assimilate the changes you would want at a different master size. And because the magnifications were so large and because they would make sometimes 1-point increments of fonts, it wouldn't be unheard of to cut 2 patterns from one drawing. So the 11-point and the 12-point might be cut from one drawing as opposed to redrawing the whole font again.
Or a pattern from another font could be used with a newer font.
Yep.
And they would borrow it because, like the M dash.
Yep.
Yeah. Or the number sign. There
was a lot of that went on primarily and earliest on with accents. So this whole thing about, you keep drawing accents over and over and you see how redundant they are. So you can sort of build up a library of accents.
That's right.
Reuse those over and over by repositioning.
Because our biggest problem in the order department were all the substitutions that went on.
Right. This was a little piece of trickery just caught my eye. But for the dictionary, you need the upside down schwa.
Yes.
That's why you have 2 crosses here.
So you just turn it over.
Right. Anything you could rotate or do like that on font, you would do that.
I told Matt that he only designed 4 characters and the computer did everything else.
So that was the original.
Yeah, so this is more of the same. Okay.
So that's for primary tagging.
Right. So this is interesting because I told you 1.5 is a minimum, but this has no sidebar.
So it was straight to
0. So you see more of the same here, but it's a little more severe, right? Because of the italic angle.
Yes. So again, that was for hot metal.
Hot metal.
And
Linotype. And there's a Tron version. See? So you can see this one's a little more upright.
And again, the curve is okay, different.
Yeah, you know what the limitation on the kern was for the CRT, which is why we drew these angle lines always had a point of rotation that was so far up from the base.
Okay, so you had this sort of nice.
And you couldn't get too close this way.
Okay.
Or it would flip the character. So there was a limitation on an angle, if you will.
I see.
Interesting thing here that you'd have to go get this font upstairs and see if it bears out. But see, this is a 2-letter font, right? Meaning there's 2 designs on the one piece of brass.
Yes.
So each of these characters needs to fit on the same width. Roman writes out. Okay, but what you could do is you could make special number 5 lowercase. Okay, so you haven't solved the kerning problems. Okay, see, like the F looks kind of wide there and so on.
Yes.
But this is not on the same width as this. Okay, so this has to match its Roman counterpart.
So would these be single letter matrices?
Yeah, that's right. And if you found the Linotype version of this font upstairs, I would say that these would be the drawings that we unitized, not these. Okay, because you had no duplexing issues with Linotype.
So but not every typeface would have a special number 5.
Only their most popular book fonts.
And would they always be called special number 5? That was the name for the non-duplex italic.
Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea about it. So which specimen, which year is?
Frank says 58.
58 was the last one they ever did. That's the soft cover. There's also a hardcover version of it. And after that, it was just specimen sheets they did. And then when they entered the postscript era, they did those postscript books. The ones with the spiral bindings on. And the last big one they did was 1939, 1940, the big red book. As you can imagine, it cost a fortune to do those things.
Oh, yeah. Specimen books are one of the hardest things to develop anyway. Just the nature of it with all the fonts makes it a bear, you know.
By the way, I was involved in the Linotype specimen book, which was never published because Mike Parker had been working on it for 7 years and got 1 page out. And so they gave me the job. And I had someone in New York City who had bought the Linotype do the pages. And so we finally got a book together.
Yes.
But then they decided not to publish it.
Why did they decide against
Because the VIP was coming out.
All right. It was by the time they
Too late.
That's right. It took years to do it.
Too late. Those were the logo types. That's how you do a logo type in the hot metal days, right? You just put the 2 characters on 1 piece of metal. This one is another extra wide paper. And then this was really what they had for kerning. Up until the film machines. And then the film machines, to my recollection, Frank would know if he was working on specimen books and stuff. You had, I'm not too familiar with line of film, but VIP, you had like a sprocket on the front of the machine and you run a paper tape through it. And you can tape with load widths for characters and also load the kerning information, as I recall.
And you had automatic kerning for certain letter combinations, but you could actually manually backspace.
Right, so the user could.
Yeah. But you then had to know what you were doing in terms of the 18-unit system to make it work properly. And so people learned that after a while. And then as time went on, the kerning program got more and more sophisticated.
So if you look at the earlier or even second generation line of film machines, VIP and so on, line of film as well, things kind of settled into a standard, what I call roughly a standard set of kerning code, which was about 120. Something in that neighborhood, and that was all of the unfortunate characters like V's and W's and Y's followed by vowels, and the ones you're always familiar with. And that pretty much stayed state of the art until the digital age. And then all things became possible, you know, especially once you had computerized font development programs and digital data is just how many units. But if you look, even the relationship, for example, between Adobe and Linotype was very close in the early days. companies, and all of their first fonts were Linotype fonts. And if you look at, even though their technology was cutting edge, PostScript, Bezier curves, all that, those same 120 kerning pairs is what they offered. Because that was the data that was there.
There was some computer systems that advertised thousands of kerning pairs.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you got to the point where you could do it almost automatically based on the shapes of the letters.
Yes.
Right.
And it was the typosit that started tight spacing. Before that, hot metal spacing was what everybody wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Then all of a sudden, they wanted kerning of selected characters. Then they wanted kerning of everything.
Right. So then came tracking and kerning and all of this stuff. And a lot of that has moved into the application arena itself, in design and so on. Does a lot of that. There was an intermediary time there with, I know Peter Caro spent a lot of time with Herman Zoff on the Kernus program, and that was an application that was sold. So various people took cracks at it, like kind of the ultimate letter spacing algorithm.
And of course, today you can do anything because PostScript is a 1,000-unit system.
Right.
So.
There's Wally Petty. He still works at Bitch.
Okay.
And the only thing I haven't found in these boxes were the type samples. Maybe we can go find them. I never.
Now, it seemed to me that you make a blueprint from something else.
Yeah, it was drawn, by hand and lettered by hand, and then it was blueprinted in multiple copies. And there's an issue. Sometimes you see different references to the letter drawing office, but MI is one of those.
So what was MI?
Yeah, I don't know. But MI meant letter drawing.
Okay.
So they used IASO blueprints when they wanted to make multiple copies of these drawings.
Yes. Crane Company built them, yes. This watermelon.
They used very high quality paper, no doubt about that.
And down at one end of a long room, you had a giant board. And you took all these glass plaques and you snapped them into position.
So you were making like a big matrix grid.
Yeah, that's right. And through the sewer pipe camera, take one big picture. That was Linotype.
So I think it was called the sewer pipe camera.
And they used the same system for the Linofilm Quick.
Sewer pipe because it was, however it focused, and whatever, it was, just a big, long, two-wheeler camera.
So then with the Linofilm Quick, they did the same thing, but it was a simpler font because they didn't have the metal edge around it.
Right.
And so that was, they had a silver halide emulsion on the glass, and then at the end of the sewer pipe, they exposed that and then put it into a development tank. And that's how and then, by the way, they still had to manually opaque parts of it.
Right.
So is that why all these little touches there would
That's correct. They cleaned it all up and double checked it.
And why would you have these black squares?
Because they left openings, thinking that people could actually put in characters at some point in time. Okay. And those holes created a problem, so they covered them over for light going through, seeping through. Okay. The Quick used this almost the same system as the Linofilm, but a cheaper piece of glass and a cheaper system.
Yeah. And this is VIP. Right?
That's correct.
And so now we're getting a little bit smarter. So instead of a glass plaque for each character, you could take this and divide it into thirds across. All right, of 32 characters each.
Okay.
And so each third would be represented by a glass plaque. Right. So they went from Frisket photography. They went from Frisket to one glass plaque per character to Frisket to 32 characters per glass plaque.
Okay.
Then the two on the left would always be the same. That's your A to Z's and figures and so on. The one on the right, they would alter.
You could customize them.
Yeah. For newspaper pie or for a foreign language or for whatever. Okay, so...
when I found in the archives at the Smithsonian, they had like blank grids where you could just draw and say which characters you wanted. These were printed,
Yes.
so you couldn't change them, and these were like empty.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
Okay.
All right.
There was also a machine they don't talk about called the Linotype, which used a film strip. And that was
the dry process one, right?
No, this was the attempt to create
this is the office machine.
That's right.
The little office machine.
The evolutionary machine. And you needed a width plug with that, by the way. So you had a width plug that had all the width values on it. The one that erased was the Omnitech, the one with the silver head. What was it? It was the Omnitech, and it used paper coated with zinc oxide.
Yeah. And
it was the first.
If you got too aggressive hand on it, you'd smear it.
I used to call it the Omni Edsel.
Just to make sure when I take the pictures.
Made in 1926.
By the way, that was the heyday.
Converted to film.
Very interesting. But so it was kerning.
Yes. Well, linofilm you could.
So these would refer, when it says current to unit, that would only refer to the line.
That's right.
Okay. I'm going to take pictures of them. What's going on here?
Yeah, maybe a damaged drawing or something that got replaced. Looks like someone even tried to do a version of the letterbox title block. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that. Maybe it got torn up.
So, if we look, would the lowercase be in the same block?
Yeah, should be.
So,
And hey,
which one would this be?
in the 30 C.
Oh, here.
Hey,
Okay, so the way, so they would turn two units so that all characters could join on the line film.
yeah. Mm-hmm. There's some interesting stuff going on here. Is right. It looks like this is the original terminal.
Okay.
Okay, this is the 26th drawing.
So here.
And this terminal was replaced by this terminal.
And then turn two
And then
units
turn
so that it would go.
for the joining. You see all of this thing in the back here, checking out how it joins. You know?
So, do you think this would actually be from the old metal drawing as well? It looks like these were part of the same.
Yeah, maybe.
So, on the old metal drawing, you would have like a little tail coming out.
Yeah, this on this side and this on this side to give the impression that it's
they were connecting. And then it was all replaced by just this one chunk.
Yeah, that's right.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Linear they are. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay, this is 2000s for a hairline. And this is just a bit more than that, 2 3/4 thousands. And you can see the width of the character.
It's much wider.
Yeah.
So when they created two masters, they would use one for a certain range of sizes and one for another range of sizes. And how many masters might you have in some cases?
For hot metal, you might have had a complete range drawn even on 1 point increments for some particular fonts. For a good portion of the library, not 1 point increments, maybe 2 point increments, and mostly within a range of, let's say, 8 to 18. And from those, traditionally they chose 8 point for text setting, or for the low range, 12 point for the mid range, and the 18 point artwork for the upper range. Okay. And they all had their scale limits. So in other words, if you wanted to maximize the output size of the machine, you had to buy the C range font.
Okay.
And don't forget, they didn't make every point size in every font in the hot metal era.
Right.
Some fonts didn't have 7, they started at 8.
Right. That might be something to do with using the font in combination with Garmin.
That could be.
I don't know.
There were some very strange combinations that were created, mostly because customers wanted them.
Here are Linotype, please.
Okay, great.
So those would be, this was the earliest samples. This is the stuff that would come back to the drawing office as the earliest examples of making its way through the manufacturing process. What's in here? You find these about as often as you don't.
It's interesting.
And I'll bet that
18-point line of script, and that's the box of the line of text. Oh no, that line of text.
Oh, it does say script, doesn't it? And it is line of script. So this more. Oh, yes. No, I took this from here.
Okay.
So sorry, I confused you. This belongs over here.
All right. Yes.